So for those of you that don't know me, my name's Ivana Iwasaki. I'm one of the lawyers here at the firm, and it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. So our next speaker is Emma Gao. Emma is a registered psychotherapist who began her career in the adult developmental services sector, where she supported individuals facing co-occurring mental and physical health challenges. This experience fueled her passion for making psychotherapy more accessible to neurodivergent individuals. Today, Emma will share her expertise on navigating the path to recovery from sexual abuse. Please join me in welcoming Emma.
Hello, everyone. Okay, so I just want to clarify, I'm pointing this way, right? Yeah, okay, perfect. All right. So thank you so much for that introduction. So together today, we're going to be navigating the path of recovery from sexual abuse. More specifically, we'll be looking at the psychological complexities of sexual abuse, taboo topics on the matter, and tangible skills for healing. Oh, okay. There were accidental touches during sessions, and he commented on how beautiful I was becoming. He would ask for hugs, longer each time. He would touch my lower back when he walked by. No one seemed to think anything of it. The comments made me squirm, but I respected and I trusted this person. Everyone else thought it was pretty cool. I saw her as a family member, like a mom or an aunt. So when she called me upstairs while she was undressing, I didn't really think anything of it. Each of these statements is the beginning of someone's experience with sexual abuse, most of them not initially understanding what it was or what it could turn into, some denying what it was. So let's better understand what sexual abuse is. So sexual abuse is an umbrella term that describes non-consensual displays of sex. So sexual assault is referring to the non-consensual sexual actions. Typically, it involves some form of physical contact. It's committed against a person's will, or when a person is not capable of consenting, so when they're a child or they're under the influence of drugs or alcohol. This might include acts such as rape or performing oral sex on a participant who is unwilling or unable to consent. Oftentimes, it will include threats of violence. Sexual exploitation is hallmarked by that power differential. This can occur when someone uses sexual acts as a way to benefit personally, or when someone is in a position of power and exploits somebody's vulnerabilities. This might include providing drugs or housing to someone in exchange for sexual favors, threatening to provide a student with a bad grade if they don't comply with a sexual act, or a doctor insisting that you undress parts of your body that he's not or she is not examining. Sexual harassment is the unwelcomed advances of a sexual nature. This might come in the form of stalking, sexually suggestive comments or jokes, and it often begins as non-verbal acts and escalates to some form of manipulation, implying that someone might be ostracized, for example, if they push back against a coworker wanting a hug. Eventually, sexual harassment often turns physical. Stealthing is a bit of a newer term. It refers to engaging in consensual sex with a condom and then removing it without the participant knowing. Recently, there have been pushes to make this definition more broad and inclusive. That might include referring to any sexual act that was initially consensual but turns into one that is not, or the act of removing any form of a contraceptive that might protect a person from pregnancy or a sexually transmitted disease. Next, we're going to look at the Canadian sexual abuse statistics. Oh. Can you guys see that? Okay, from this angle I can't see it, all right. So 1 in 3 women and 1 in 6 men report being sexually abused at some point in their life. That means that in any given vicinity, you are likely in the same vicinity as somebody who has been sexually abused in some way, shape, or form. 80% of people who experience sexual abuse are groomed prior or during the process of sexual abuse, meaning that they're manipulated into potentially participating in it later on. An example of that might be buying a child toys so that they gain the trust of the child and the trust of the parents, then later taking them out to a movie where they can be alone with the child in order to perform sexual acts. Oftentimes we find that people who are groomed during the process of sexual abuse actually stand up for the perpetrator at the end because of the confusion that they experience through that process. 96% of sexual abuse goes unreported, and of that 96%, only 20% actually ever results in any form of a charge. I will never forget a vacation that I took with some of my girlfriends. There was 6 of us. And during that trip, I learned that I was the only person in that room who hadn't been sexually abused in some way, shape, or form. One of the most shocking things about this topic is that most survivors of sexual abuse know the perpetrator. This means that the majority of the time, the abuser is not somebody who kidnaps you off the street. Rather, it's a neighbor, it's a partner, it's a friend, it's a professional, it's a family friend, or it's a family member. So let's do a little bit of psychoeducation on why sexual abuse might occur, other than pedophilic disorders, which is someone's attraction to young children. Power, control, and manipulation. It's not uncommon to hear stories of sexual abuse that occur over the years. While the story of the Menendez brothers remains a controversial topic, the current documentary on the brothers' case exemplifies this topic perfectly. For those who are not familiar with the case, in 1989, 2 brothers shot their parents to death in their Beverly Hills home, seemingly to get a hold of their large fortune. During the first trial, they stated that the motive was to actually escape years of sexual abuse. Many argue that because the brothers were grown men, they simply could have left, they could have contacted the police, or they could have discussed the issue with their therapist. Thus, the abuse must have been falsified. This argument, however, does not consider that from a young age, the brothers were manipulated into believing that their father would murder them, and it was a secret that families typically keep. The cultural context at the time as well reinforced that sexual abuse was only a thing that happened to women. In addition to that, their mother, a person who was in a position of power, was both dismissive and likely participated in the abuse, creating a dynamic that communicated that even those in a position of power would not help them. Impunity is another reason that sexual abuse occurs. There's a degree of hush-hush culture associated with sexual abuse. Hush-hush culture is when people don't want to talk about something that's uncomfortable or potentially perceived as taboo. This can happen in several different ways, from handling sexual abuse within a family and not reporting it, all the way to dismissing that it even occurred. While families often had good intentions by not wanting to label a child or a family friend as a perpetrator of sexual abuse, or they feel they can potentially set boundaries with a grandparent who's perpetrating sexual abuse, this contributes to a lack of consequences for the perpetrator, prioritizes their well-being, results in a lack of resources for both the victim and the perpetrator. It normalizes that hush-hush culture and enables the perpetrator to act again. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about toxic cultural traits. So these are traits that occur in any environment that reinforces and normalizes unhealthy behaviors. Toxic cultural traits occur in subcultures, meaning smaller pockets of larger groups. This might refer to a department at work, a spiritual or religious group, or those rooted in some form of hobby or potentially gender. More and more frequently, we're seeing documentaries that discuss the sexual acts that religious cult leaders expect of their followers. When the culture around you normalizes some form of blind obedience, perpetrators of sexual abuse use this as an opportunity to victimize vulnerable people. Generational cycles gets its own slide. Generational cycles are the beliefs and their corresponding behaviors that get passed down through generations. There are two kinds of generational cycles, transgenerational and intergenerational. Transgenerational being things that have been passed down multiple times through generations, and intergenerational is the exchange between two generations, so mother and child. Hush-hush culture creates a risk of these generational cycles. Individuals who have been abused are at a higher risk of developing liberal mindsets towards sex, which in turn can cause some confusion between abuse and sexual freedom. It's not uncommon in my practice that survivors report being pressured into acts that they later regret in the name of sexual freedom. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit about Martha. Martha watched her 9-year-old daughter Emily kick a soccer ball with joy. But when Emily begged to join the local team, Martha firmly said no, masking her refusal with excuses about cost and time. The truth was rooted in Martha's past. Years earlier, as a talented gymnast, she endured abuse from a trusted coach. Her parents dismissed her pleas, leaving her to carry trauma alone, and thus she vowed to protect her children from the same kind of pain that she went through. Over time, Emily stopped asking about joining the soccer team. She felt left out and she felt resentful towards her mom. One evening, she blurted out, "Why don't you trust me or anybody else?" Her words shook Martha, forcing her to confront how her fear was shaping Emily's life. With courage, Martha shared her story, explaining her pain and her overprotectiveness. Emily listened and pleaded, "I want to try. I want to be part of something." In this moment, Martha had a decision to make. She would be able to try and break the cycle, or she may continue to perpetuate it. Some of the factors that influence risk around sexual abuse are age, disability, poverty, homelessness, living in an institutional setting such as a long-term care facility or a rehabilitation center, and being part of the LGBTQ+ community. The common factor with all of these groups being the vulnerability of that community, meaning that they're likely to attract opportunistic people, such as a PSW who is frequently alone with elderly or frail clients. Now we're going to look at probably the most important step, at least in my experience, and that's talking about some of the uncomfortable topics that come with sexual abuse. I think that's the one that's making that noise. Survivors of sexual abuse often come into my office riddled with shame, self-blame, confusion, and part of the healing process requires me to help clients shift their maladaptive narratives from issues about their own personal qualities and characteristics to one about unique outcomes, survival, and a misalignment in values between them and the perpetrator. In order to do that, we have to demystify the following topics. These often hold survivors back from being able to repair that narrative. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about the relationship between climax and sexual abuse. It's one that is deeply distressing for survivors, but it's very important to discuss. When we think about sexual abuse, we often imagine what is shown in the media. This is usually a woman. She's usually screaming for help and physically trying to fight off her attacker. But this response only represents a small fraction of actual reactions to being sexually abused. For some people, they have what's called a dissociative response, where they go into a freeze mode and they disconnect mentally from their bodies. For other people, their body goes into a protective mode where they prepare for the abuse physically. In order to stop their reproductive organs from being damaged, this can result in a climax during the abuse. The research is not clear on how often this happens, but it is not uncommon at all to occur for either both men or women. Somewhere between 5% and 30% of survivors experience this. Climax is not a synonym for consent and should not be treated as such. Next, we're going to explore sex, abuse, and marriage. Sexual abuse in marriage can be a deeply confusing topic for victims because of the societal and personal expectations that surround marital intimacy. Many people hold the belief that spouses have a duty to be physically available to each other, which can blur the lines of consent and make it difficult to recognize when boundaries are being crossed. Victims often question whether it's normal or expected to comply with their partner's sexual attitudes, even when it makes them uncomfortable. Abusers may further manipulate this confusion by using love. If you loved me, you just let me do it. Or obligation. I know you just had a baby, but I have needs. As a result, victims can feel isolated, struggling to identify their experiences as abuse because they don't see the big deal in marital relationships. This confusion can prevent victims from seeking any sort of help as they fear judgment or potentially disbelief. If you are experiencing ignoring of boundaries after you Thank you so much. So if you are experiencing, yeah, we're good. I think we're good. Okay. If you are experiencing ignoring of boundaries after you have expressed them or been in some sort of a state of incapacitation and used for a partner's sexual pleasure, it is abuse, even if you're married. Next, we're going to talk briefly about the Me Too movement. Back in 2017, Me Too increased awareness around sexual abuse. This was specifically within the entertainment industry. While this movement led to a number of positive things, such as high-profile and powerful figures losing the grasp they had on so many of the exploited, it also brought up some controversy, which negatively impacted some survivors. Mainly, false allegations came alongside this movement, causing backlash against survivors. This reinforced a common fear amongst survivors. What if nobody believes me? Next, we're going to talk briefly about the female perpetrator of sexual abuse. Female perpetrators of sexual abuse are often overlooked due to societal biases and stereotypes that assume that women are inherently more nurturing and less capable of causing any form of sexual harm. However, women can and they do perpetrate sexual abuse. The female abuser may exploit positions of trust, such as becoming a caregiver or a teacher, in order to manipulate or groom a victim. Research suggests that female perpetrated abuse, though less common statistically than male perpetrated abuse, is equally as damaging, yet the victims receive less support. Male victims in particular may face unique challenges as they might feel pressured to see the abuse by a woman as cool or lucky or some proof of masculinity, rather than exploitative or harmful. The female perpetrator of sexual abuse may co-offend with somebody else. They may see their children as taking away their spouse, and they may be experiencing some form of a loss of control in their life at the time. The Canadian Children's Council published an article with over 500 female teachers who sexually abused their students. Finally, we're going to clarify the impact of sexual abuse on sexual orientation. While sexual abuse does not determine or change who somebody is attracted to, it can have an impact on the way a person connects with their sexual or intimate partners. Survivors experience confusion and self-doubt, fear and discomfort, trauma-based reactions, and they usually process their sexual identity later in life. They often link their sexual experiences with their orientation as well. This manifests in a few different ways, including anxiety around relationships and intimacy, causing them to lean into whatever feels like the safest orientation rather than what they perceive as their actual sexual orientation. The context of the abuse also creates some concern about whether the orientation was influenced. In same-sex abuse, it's not uncommon for the survivor to wonder if that means that they're homosexual. The next step in a survivor's journey is finding out what experiences shaped their own personal beliefs around sexual abuse and potentially challenging those beliefs. In my practice, what I like to do is I like to make a timeline of what throughout a client's life has shaped their view on what sexual abuse is and what sexual abuse looks like, and then further challenge that by making another timeline and seeing, well, if you had have watched this movie or you had have read this article, how do you think that compilation of things would have changed how you see sexual abuse? I grew up in Burlington, so just off the road were Leslie Mahaffey, a victim of Paul Bernardo, and Karla Homolka was abducted in the 1990s. I remember very, very clearly how this shaped my narrative of how I saw sexual abuse when I was young. It was a person who kidnapped you off the streets, not a professional and not a family friend, as I mentioned it most commonly is earlier. So if anyone is comfortable, I would like to invite you guys to share what shaped your thoughts around what sexual abuse is or isn't. This might be movies, this might be TV shows, this might be a story from a parent. If anyone wants to participate, just put your hand up and we'll see. No? Yeah, go ahead.
Watch the 8 o'clock CTV movie of the evening on weeknights. And I was, between 8 and 14 when we watched those movies almost every night. And a recurring theme in the movies that would play was a victim or a woman making up that she had been sexually assaulted. And so I had had these dozens and dozens of examples as a child of how women lie and make up sexual assault before I had ever met anyone who identified as a survivor or identified as knowing someone who had actually experienced a real sexual assault.
Mm-hmm. So did that perpetuate the idea that you thought that false allegations were actually quite common?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
I saw someone else with a hand up. Anyone else want to share? Go ahead.
Oh, thank you so much. I think without getting into too much details, I'm trying to think how to frame this. I think I thought that myself or parents that really took care of their children would be able to recognize someone who had the potential to sexually abuse, especially children. And unfortunately, in my community, there was someone who we later found out was sexually abusing some children in the neighborhood. And so many amazing, intelligent, loving parents trusted him. And I think I thought, wow, okay, maybe I don't know who's capable of this. I used to think that it's either someone very creepy or very charming, but it's not always that clear, I think. So that shaped some of my perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of parents feel that way. They think that they're able to know if their own child is being sexually abused. A lot of parents feel like they'd be able to recognize the signs and symptoms, but oftentimes there isn't any, and that's something we'll get to later.
Hi, my name's Anne Marie. I was sexually abused by 3 different men between the ages of 5 and 7. And then again, sexually exploited by my high school music teacher when I was in high school. And I think I just normalized it. I think my early childhood experience meant that I thought this was normal behavior. And even though I grew up, obviously I had issues with mental illness, but I eventually had a very successful career in the federal government, became a deputy minister, but completely fell apart when I saw my teacher when I was in my 50s. But I think what that tells me is that it's very easy to normalize and deny what's happened to you. And I think as well, all of the signals, in my case, it was my high school adult abuse that really was damaging to me the most. And I think it's because you realize the institution that the abuse took place in had also normalized the abuse, and the adults around knew what was going on and nobody did anything about it. And so I think the environment you're in and how you perceive people reacting to it. I now do research in this area, and all the survivors that I speak to have all said that the institutional abusers anyways, priests, teachers, and scout leaders, et cetera, have all had multiple victims, and there's almost always adults who know what's going on. And so no wonder we think it's okay, and we can't define what abuse is when children or young children or adolescents see people around them normalizing the behavior. And so I think that's a real problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we got one more over there.
Hi. From a very young age, I felt quite a dichotomy. I grew up in a family that things happened in that were inappropriate. They were normalized. They were not talked about. It was taboo, largely shaped by the indoctrination of a religious aspect to it as well. So it was very negative and very difficult to deal with that. Yet the dichotomy I felt even from a very young age, of even having been victimized by it, I had in a system, the education system, where I recognize lots can happen in the bad regard, I had a lot of teachers who were, and this was back in the early 70s, actually speaking positive reinforcement that I knew that what was happening to me at home was not appropriate. I still didn't have the courage at the time to do anything about it, but that was the dichotomy that already existed. I saw people in positions of authority giving positive messaging and information, and then through sort of health class, et cetera, I grew up in Toronto, there were resources that were already at that point being mentioned. And then I also saw the dichotomy in the media. You saw the negative perpetration of stereotypes and roles, and yet I remember even after school ABC specials, some of the characters like, what's her name, Hunt and, oh, my mind's gone blank. Anyway, the two that were really popular in the 70s, and the positive messaging of how they stood up for themselves and the chutzpah that those characters had, I think was how it really shaped my views of becoming a protector and knowing that what was happening to me was wrong. I didn't have the courage as a child to deal with it, but I knew. So it was interesting that that dichotomy always existed, and now as an adult many years later, still dealing with literally both sides of that fence as a victim and an advocate now.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much for sharing that. I don't know if somebody wants to take that microphone. Okay, perfect. Okay, good, that still works. Okay, well, thank you so much to everybody who just shared their stories or their own instances of sexual abuse that shaped their narrative around what it is. All of those things contribute. Movies, experiences at home, experiences with people of authority, even the legal system, as Emily pointed out. The legal system has a huge impact. There was a case back in the early 2000s of Brian Peck. He was a producer, and he victimized a number of sexually abused a number of young children. And he was put in prison for only 16 months, even though he abused several young children, and it was ongoing all the way through teenage years. And it actually turned into some forms of stalking as well. And so what does that tell you when somebody is sent to jail, if they're even convicted, for only 16 months, right? So next, we're going to look at some more of the psychological aspects. So we've covered some of the basic information at this point. We've talked a little bit about some of the confusing or uncomfortable topics that people struggle with. So a lot of people who have been sexually abused will struggle with attachment issues. So they might develop an insecure attachment style. They may struggle with a generationally altered stress response. That's where generational cycles come in from earlier. They may struggle with memory issues. It is not uncommon at all that clients come into the office and they'll say things like, I don't know if I want to dig this up because I can't really fully remember it. It's kind of just fragmented and I'm really not sure it even happened. They may have distorted views of boundaries in relationships. They may struggle with low self-esteem and chronic and ongoing mental health issues throughout their life. So supporting a survivor of sexual abuse is a profound act of compassion and empowerment. By using these skills, you're making the world a little bit more of an accessible place for survivors. So let's look at these skills. As Emily had also said before, provide survivors with control over as many aspects of the situation as possible. Avoid prying for extra or unnecessary details. Take note of the language that they're using to describe their experience and try to use similar words, and allow them to dictate what their next steps are. If they're not ready to use the word survivor, that's okay. They may prefer the word victim at the time. Try summarizing, paraphrasing, and validating the experience that they had, instead of interrogating them or trying to solve an unsolvable problem. So what does a validating phrase sound like? It sounds like that experience made you feel powerless. That emotion makes sense. Or, I'm sorry this happened to you. You should never have had to go through that. Ask them open-ended questions. Tell me more about that feeling of powerlessness. Or, what did you think of the suggestion that your mother made to report the abuse? Instead of telling them to report the abuse. Avoid, whoa, oh my God, that is so bad, you have to report that. Or, why didn't you just leave? Or, that must have been difficult for you, but at least they didn't rape you. Sexual abuse is a traumatic memory for most survivors, if not all. Trauma lives in our bodies, meaning that it leaves lasting imprints on both our physical and emotional health. Any form of sensory input can trigger these symptoms and result in a panic response or potentially a dissociative episode. Here are a couple of skills that you can use if you or a survivor around you is experiencing this. These are really good, simple, tangible skills for people who work with sexual abuse survivors, such as lawyers, that you can even use in your own office. I want everybody in the room to look around this room and just think in your mind, what are 3 things here that are red? Give you a couple seconds because this room is pretty purple. Okay, now I want you all to look around this room and tell me what are 3 things that are orange. You don't have to tell me, just keep it in your head. Okay, so you get the gist. This is called rainbow grounding. So you can use this during an experience when somebody is going through a dissociative episode where they have that disconnect between the mind and body. Maybe they're zoning out a little bit. You see something like that. The idea is you want to get all the way to the end of the rainbow, and by that time, hopefully they're a little bit more grounded. Next, and very similarly, you can use your senses as a way to also activate that same part of your brain. So by holding something in your hand, anything that's in front of you works. Your goal is to describe the sensory experience you're having with the object. So what does it feel like? What does it smell like? Those kinds of things. And that's something, if somebody is having a response in your office, that you can give to them and try to have them do. Prior to doing that, though, you want to try and activate the parasympathetic nervous system in the brain. That causes a calming effect. So that's where you can use a skill like splashing cold water on your face, holding ice cubes in your hand, putting ice cubes on the back of your neck, any of those kinds of things. Those who struggle with these symptoms often feel like they're back in the event and reliving it again. Try to use language that reminds the person of where they are and the fact that they're safe. Try not to panic, because your own ability to regulate your emotions can allow the other person to co-regulate with you. Try saying something like, "It's Emma, your lawyer. You're having a panic attack right now, and that's okay. I'm going to stay here with you until it's over. We're safe, sitting on my couch in my office." Now we're going to talk a little bit about supporting yourself. No matter how many years later it might be, supporting yourself is a great way to break generational cycles. Parents who are survivors of sexual abuse should utilize mental health professionals to better understand the function of their parenting behaviors. Earlier in this presentation, I used the example of a parent that unintentionally ostracized their child by restricting their ability to participate in sports. Understanding whether this decision is an effort to protect or a response to a thought of your child being abused may help you explore the impact of that decision. Using the what if trick can be an easy way to challenge some of those thoughts. So for every what if negative, you want to look at the what if positive. So what if I can't ensure nothing bad happens to my child while they're in the dressing room? On the other hand, what if I can use this as an opportunity to educate my child on appropriate touching and provide them with a level of confidence? Employees who have been sexually abused may struggle with confidence and boundary setting in the workplace. Setting small, manageable goals at work increases resilience and fosters a sense of accomplishment. By the same token, setting workplace boundaries specifically related to triggers in the workplace is a great example of how you can take your power back. When we discuss trauma, it's important to consider what actions give the abuse and the abuser power over your life. We give the abuse and the abuser power by quitting a job that we love because your coworker is demanding that you give them hugs at the end of the day. We take our power back by setting a boundary and reporting this to HR and staying in that job that we love. Sexual abuse survivors can support themselves by prioritizing a routine of self-care, exercise, sleep, nutrition, regular visits to the doctor, and regular visits to a mental health professional that you trust. Therapy and counseling can provide a safe space for processing emotions and help you to build coping strategies. You should lean into reconciling and coping with the problem rather than avoiding it. We'll move past this just because we're running out of time here. If you have experienced sexual abuse, you may benefit from visiting Ending Violence Canada or the Durham Rape Crisis Center. If you are a professional who has clientele who have perpetrated sexual abuse, you may benefit from referring them over to the Sexual Behavior Clinic through CMHA or visit VoiNet for at-home resources. Thank you so much for being here with me today.